Hello, everyone, and welcome to Internet Theatre, a DocPerform webinar. My name is Joseph Dunne-Howrie. I am the Artist in Residence at the Department of Library and Information Science at City, University of London. I would like to take this opportunity to welcome our panel, Elena Araoz, Joe Scott, and Harry Wilson. The format for this evening will be as follows. I will begin by discussing the background to the DocPerform project and provide some context for tonight's webinar. Each of our panelists will then speak for about 10 minutes. The four of us will then go into a round table discussion before answering questions from the audience, which you can do with the Q&A function. So I will just bring up my PowerPoint. I can see people are still entering, so I will go nice and slowly. So hopefully everyone can now see the first slide, Internet Theatre DocPerform webinar. So if any of the panelists...
Not yet, Joe, just to say it's not there yet.
Not there yet, okay. Can you see it now?
No.
I wonder if let me try again. Can you see that now?
Yep, that's looking good. You just need to press that little button and then you...
Thank you. So like I said, the Q&A chat is now open, so you can post questions at any time. And you can also join in the discussion on Twitter using the hashtag Internet Theatre. And you can also get updates about the DocPerform project by following us at DocPerform. DocPerform is an interdisciplinary project which explores the processes associated with the creation, documentation, preservation, and archiving of performance. The project aims to encourage connections and conversations around performance as a document and the performativity of the contemporary information environment. DocPerform has a particular interest in emerging document formats, which can employ technologies such as virtual reality, augmented reality, and mixed reality. The COVID-19 crisis has led us to investigate how the internet has become a performance medium where bodies, machines, and data interact to stage the dramas of the contemporary information age. Just a brief note of explanation about the title for tonight's webinar. The digital has become a relatively diffuse term signifying computational technologies, communication networks, big data, and sci-fi imaginaries of a hive mind. In contrast, the internet is the physical infrastructure of the amorphous digital cloud where we live as data subjects. Theatre, a place of seeing, makes us aware of the cloud's physical presence and acts as a stage to perform living on life. At the turn of the millennium, the producer Michael Kustow warned that theatre was under threat from the forces of globalization. He felt mass media and technology was replacing the sharing of experiences with mass exchanges of information. He argued that theatre exists through processes of embodiment and therefore can never exist on the internet. Media, digital technology, and computational processes turn theatre into a simulation of its authentic self, he argued. In both of these quotes, Kustow apocalyptically describes the internet's presence in social reality as a mutation in distinction from the clean body of theatre. But skip forward 2 decades and the world has undergone a far more radical form of mutation from COVID-19. The flow of information on the internet is coming to constitute the experience that unites all humanity. Internet theatre can help us understand what this sense of flow is doing to our sense of reality. Whilst the epistemology for this practice is still evolving, we can identify important characteristics of its form. Specifically, internet theatre never becomes fully present as an aesthetic construct residing in a space that is entirely separate from the audience's world. A constant exchange of information flows across the porous digital boundary between what dramaturg Marianne van Kerhoven calls the minor dramaturgy, inhabited by the audience. Internet theatre is thus performed in a hybrid space of mediated realities, where the physical world of the audience acts as the structural world for the fictional performance. To give 3 brief examples of internet theatre. False Entertainment's End Meeting for All is a piece in 3 parts devised on Zoom. 6 actors tried to get an improvisation going using bits of costume and poetry, but they can never exceed simulation. Each remains isolated in their small window of space and time, vainly signalling each other across the void of cyberspace to establish a temporary human connection. In their failure to create a fictional performance in End Meeting for All, False Entertainment stage our ongoing struggle to adapt to living in the cloud. The primary dramaturgy of this piece is the attempt and failure to tell a coherent narrative by bodies that only exist in digital proximity to each other. Zoom as a stage cannot but defictionalize the dramas which play out on it, because it is now a place where the reel of lockdown is performed every day. Based on the book by Mark O'Donnell, To Be a Machine asks if COVID-19 is accelerating the dreams of transhumanists. Transhumanism is a tech utopian philosophy positing that humans and machines will one day merge into new life forms. Biohacking, cryogenic freezing, and mind filing are just some of the science fictional imaginaries of humanity's future that transhumanists are trying to make a reality. Spectators upload themselves into the cloud by recording themselves reacting to stimuli. In the reverse of the Turing test, spectators then have to prove that they are not bots by answering a series of questions during the live streamed show. As messages from the audience flashed on the screen, I briefly wondered if I was the only real human being watching. How would I know? Finally, the internet version of Javid Alipour's Rich Kids, A History of Shopping Malls in Tehran uses Instagram to tell the story of the Anthropocene. The audience experience history as a series of endless scrollbacks into the void of social media. The Instagram feed acts as a metaphor for how technology curates the past into invented narratives, which in turn shape humanity's experience of time. The phone is framed as a techno-fossil that is documenting the end of our civilization, whilst also acting as a talisman for creating a future for its technological immortality. And just looking beyond today, in Britain, Brexit has now come to pass, and with it, the end of free movement. In order for artists to keep working in the networks they've spent a long time establishing, they'll probably be ever more reliant on remote working. That is certainly exacerbated by COVID-19, where restrictions on travel are likely to remain in place for some time. And of course, we have the climate emergency where we do need to be traveling less, and therefore working on the internet becomes perhaps an ethical concern as well, where we need to burn less fossil fuels, certainly flying less. So I will stop the share now. That offers just some context for this evening's talk. Apologies for people who might have missed the very start of that. I think Zoom was just a little bit slow in letting people in. So I would like to now go over to our first speaker, Harry Wilson. Harry is lecturer in performing arts at Dundee and Angus College. And I should say as well, full bios of our speakers are available on the DocPerform website. So Harry, over to you.
Okay, thanks, Joe. I'm just going to share also. And thanks for that great kind of context today. I think it's really useful to have some of those kind of ideas floating about before we start. Okay, I need to do that. So I'm going to start by just giving a little bit of context about what I was doing before COVID-19 happened. So between October 2018 and October 2019, I was in residence with the National Theatre of Scotland as their digital thinker, which was a kind of a fancy name for a kind of academic in residence position. So I was there for a year, and I was researching the use of digital and emerging technologies in theatre and performance. In particular, I was looking at kind of cross art form work between theatre and performance on the one hand, and immersive and interactive media, and also kind of online digital content that the organisation might kind of be interested in producing that might sit somewhere between kind of theatre and film, for example. And here's me there with someone I was working with, collaborator Julie Williamson, and we were looking at the use of virtual reality in intimate performance specifically. So, you know, while I was in residence at National Theatre of Scotland with this focus, it was kind of impossible to escape discussions of medium specificity. I mean, I guess if you've got theatre in your name as a company, then most people probably think you should be producing theatre. So, you know, part of my role was to kind of reflect on what makes theatre theatre, to think about what might make online performances live, but also how digital technologies and their use in theatre kind of changes our idea of what theatre can be and how it can be defined. And obviously these questions have been kind of well rehearsed in theatre and performance studies, but maybe less so in some kind of professional or industry context. So it was a kind of hopefully like mutually beneficial placement that I was on, kind of helping them to reflect on some of these questions. Obviously, little did any of us know at the time that these questions would kind of take on even greater urgency for theatre makers and venues in the wake of theatre closures due to COVID-19. So in the UK context, theatres closed at the end of March. Some of them opened up again in some parts of the UK, but where I am in Scotland, no theatres have been open since that time. So we've seen a lot of venues and companies kind of reimagining their offer to their audiences when they can't produce live theatre, in inverted commas. And this, as we've seen, has included like streaming of archive productions, live streaming new works from theatre venues, as well as theatres collaborating with filmmakers to create short films or TV productions. And that's a kind of an area that NTS has explored with their series of short films, Scenes for Survival, and also their project with Edinburgh International Festival, Ghostlight, as well. Among this kind of work, I guess we've seen other work that's emerged or maybe become more visible that has interested me slightly more. And this work has focused on intimate moments of encounter with audiences at home. So we've had a series of, you know, Zoom performances, immersive audio works, or performances you watch on your smartphone. And these have become much more kind of readily available, I think. In a number of the works that I've kind of actively sought out since March 2020, ideas of what, you know, liveness and performance and theatre might be has been kind of stretched across geographical and temporal boundaries to create what I would call intense moments of intimacy from a distance. So, I mean, one of the first events that I participated in last year was Gateshead International Festival of Theatre in May 2020. This is a theatre and performance festival that's been going since 2011. They usually have a 3-day festival in Gateshead in the northeast of England. And before the UK announced the first lockdown on the 24th of March, GIFT had already made the announcement that they were going to move their programme online due to the kind of safety to audiences. And quite remarkably, they managed to, I think every artist that was programmed in the festival ended up in the online version of the festival. And there were a range of forms embraced, from Greg Wohead's Sunrise to Sunset improvised durational Zoom performance, Crack of Dawn. Action Hero made a 24-hour radio show based on their project O Europa. There were also one-to-one performances, podcast-style lecture performances, and other events. So I'm going to just briefly talk about 2 performances that I saw at this festival very early on in lockdown, I guess, last year, where I kind of experienced these moments of what I would call remote connection or kind of intimacy from a distance. The first of which was Gudrun Solli's Sigurdardóttir's Elision, which was live streamed from her flat in Glasgow over Zoom and performed to a remote audience from across the world. And the piece was originally made for studio theatres and focused on an exploration and deconstruction of national identity, as well as attempting to combat a climate of division and disconnection. And all of this was channeled through Icelandic artist Sigurdardóttir's tongue-in-cheek attempts to stay warm using a set made of inflatable palm trees, Hawaiian lei, a lilo. And of course, these kind of themes of connection and warmth gained an even more potent resonance in the context of lockdown, where a remote but connected audience were brought together by Sigurdardóttir's charming performance skill and moments of audience interaction. In one moment of Elision, we were asked to take an ice cube from our freezer, place it in our hand, and try to concentrate and hold on to this fleeting moment before the ice melts away. And as well as the kind of sharp cold of the ice in my hand, I remember feeling a kind of rushing awareness of other bodies in different locations and time zones performing the same action and potentially experiencing the kind of same feeling of the freezing ice cube melting in their hand. A kind of virtual co-presence facilitated by video conferencing, but also conjured by Sigurdardóttir's skill as a theatre maker in bringing us together, even when we are apart. And the second piece I want to talk about, a gift that made a kind of lively connection with me, was Oliver Zann's In Praise of Forgetting Part 2. Zann's work was presented using the screen share feature of a Zoom webinar, much like I'm doing here. In the performance, we don't see Zann, but instead we watch his computer desktop background as he arranges and rearranges a series of Finder windows. And the piece explored stories of German refugees displaced from Middle and Eastern Europe after World War II. And the text of the performance was typed into text boxes in real time and took us through Zann's archival journey in a performance text that was part lecture and part personal discovery. In this work, Zann's desktop was the space of the performance. he used a screen as a kind of stage, and the finder windows danced about in a kind of choreography. And this was theatre that literally took place on a computer screen. It was also somewhere between computer art and an online lecture. And Zan's performance stretches our definitions of theatre, and yet there's a clear dramaturgy and theatricality that led to a kind of a remote encounter in my reception of the work. For example, in each typo that Zan makes, I became aware of the body typing at the other end of the screen. So the screen acts as an interface between Zan and us as a remote and scattered audience, perhaps something like Joe's information flow that he was talking about. So we have a live encounter between absent, physically distant bodies. How am I doing for time, Joe?
Oh, you're all good, Harry. All good.
So I guess I wanted to kind of flag up these two examples of performance that I saw that have really stayed with me since May last year. And I've seen others, but you know, for the purposes of kind of succinctness, I thought I'd focus on these two. I suppose the most impactful work I've experienced in the last year has found a way to reach out and connect with its audience, despite the restrictions, the challenges, and the distance. And it's used internet technologies to do this. These remote performances, in their own ways, have kind of reminded me of the importance of connection, of attending to others, even in a kind of long distance way, and of the importance of, to quote Matthew Goolish, signaling across the expanse. And I think I'll end there.
Thank you, Harry. It's wonderful, and we're getting some wonderful questions. I'm sorry, I'm multitasking at the moment because I know some people are finding it a little bit tricky to get in. So I will just keep on plugging away, but do keep on asking questions, folks. So Harry, wonderfully rich, and just this lovely dichotomy between privacy, intimacy. It's not really a dichotomy, I guess, but intimacy isn't necessarily a state or a feeling we usually associate with technologies like VR or the kind of wired world generally. So we'll definitely return to those points in the round table. So I would like to now introduce our second speaker, Elena Araoz. Elena is stage director of theatre and opera and a choreographer, and is also founder and director of the Socially Distanced Performance Project. So thank you.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. Like Joe was saying, I'm a theater and opera director, also a performer and a writer, and I'm also a faculty member at Princeton. And the reason I'm telling you all that is when the pandemic began, I was charged with the idea of helping my theater students at Princeton to figure out how they were going to continue performance and how they were going to continue their theater learning. And also, I thought that this might be an opportunity. I find that, at least in the United States, the theater industry or the theater field is actually a very slowly innovating organism. We don't like change. We like theater to look like the way it was when we grew up, or when our parents grew up, or when our grandparents grew up. And I've been particularly fascinated by this binary between film and theater. And at the same time, I don't like technology. I'm afraid of it. I don't like it in my life. I do everything I can to avoid living in the modern age, and don't even really like projection design in my theater unless it's absolutely essential. And so I knew that this was a time for me to think out of the box for myself. I knew this was a time for me to experiment, to find curiosity again, and to start to think about how is it that our culture is changing because of things like social media, and how is it important that theater wrestle with these new kinds of performativity. My students are well aware that the internet is nothing more than a place to perform, that taking the perfect selfie is in and of itself a kind of performative practice. And so I set out to play. I made a whole bunch of theater experiments. I thought a lot about what would work best in 2 dimensions. And I looked back at old theater techniques like shadow puppetry and even Baroque scenic design to think about how can I put a 3-dimensional world in a beautiful way onto a 2-dimensional screen. And so I'll show you a couple of pictures of those very, very handmade. I decided I would only use what I had access to in my home. So here's a couple of things. I can find just the right place, because I have to show you this way. So again, literally I made a cardboard house. I hope you can see it okay. I lit it from the inside, and I decided, since I didn't have other performers to interact with, what I did have was the trees that moved, the sounds of outside, and the sounds of neighbors arguing, which somehow became part of the plot of the piece. I decided to think, where can I find technology that emits to an audience? So this is an adaptation of a Chekhov play that I did over a Ring doorbell, which is a doorbell that has a camera on it. And what I started to realize is I was really looking for ways in which I could bring what we affectionately call, at least in the United States, theater magic to this internet space. And by theater magic, what I mean by that is that being able to create something out of nothing, which is something that I think is not the way film or television thinks, that literally cardboard and paper clips and duct tape can become something beautiful. And also that live feedback loop that happens between an audience and performer. How is it that an audience's laughter changes the performance, and how does of course the performance then change the performers change the performance that evening? And so I started this research project at Princeton called Innovations in Socially Distant Performance as a way to figure out what are the essentials of theater at a time when we've been told that really theater is not essential. Theaters were the first to close in the United States and will be the last to open. And we have struggled with finding funding and trying to define why we are so important to our society at large. And so what is it about theater that's different than all other kinds of media that that somehow we can learn by struggling with it in this online way when we've been taken away, when what has been taken away is our essentials? So we also say very affectionately in the United States, at least, that the reason theater is so important is that social political act of sitting next to strangers in a dark room with people that you would never encounter in any other way and listening to the same story. And how is it that that shared time and space could also be captured through some sort of digital portal? And how could it also allow the audience to be in direct conversation with the performers so that that feedback loop was constantly cycling? So the first piece, then bigger piece that I made with other collaborators was called A Farm for Meme by a Latin American writer named Virginia Grice. And I decided to really go back to those really basic ideas of theater magic. What can we make? How can we find playfulness? How can we find beauty out of nothing? And invite the audience in that way through a sense of play. So I'll show you a couple more pictures of Farm for Meme. We did 4 performances, 2 in English and 2 in Spanish. The play was about urban farming and about the destruction of one of the largest urban farms in the United States. And so it made seemingly a lot of sense that we would look to handmade things that people could find around their home, that our performers could find. So we could talk about how can you plant plants in concrete, or how can you make beauty out of some paper products. And so this piece about farming really lent itself very well to this very old-fashioned, simple, playful techniques of puppetry. And then as you start to blend those with actors, we start to see that that kind of unique theatricality started to emerge. After that, I was working on a new opera called Alice in the Pandemic with an opera company in Boston. And we decided to think about puppetry in a different way, to think about virtual puppetry. And so this opera, which was the first piece, at least as we understand it, that was able to live sync 3 singers together live performing at the same time, even from remote locations. And at the same time, we were capturing their voice, we were capturing their live feed, and working to puppeteer their avatars. So we were working with gamers and working in Unreal Engine. So we have the singers, we're pulling their feed. Sometimes the scenes are about the singers, and sometimes the scenes are about the 3D environments that they are inside of. And then sometimes it's about their voice coming through their avatar. So we're always keenly aware of both the performer and the puppeteer and the thing that's been being puppeted in a live space. And then after that, what I realized was what happens when you're using any kind of pre-recorded content. So I'm currently working on my first piece right now, which opens on Thursday. And because of the theater company's desire that this be online in perpetuity, we really needed to ask all the performers to record themselves live, or record themselves, and then we would play it so it wouldn't be live. And this was, of course, a big struggle for me, because I thought the whole point of everything that I'm working towards is live, the liveness in theater. And so I thought, well, if I can't have performers live, how can I still have the audience live interact with the experience in and of itself, so that the performance responds to them in a live kind of way. And this piece in and of itself is about destigmatizing mental illness. And so I started to think about, well, what is mindfulness in front of a screen? How do we, in front of a screen, think about things like our heartbeat, our heart rate, our breath? And so what we developed is an interactive experience. And these pictures I'm not supposed to share before Thursday, but I thought it's close enough. Oh, that's one more of Alice in the Pandemic, when our children's chorus feeds show up as well. And so this is the piece that will premiere on Thursday, called The Manic Monologues. And all of these icons, which you're not seeing the animation here, but everything spins. And as a mobile, everything bounces and spins. And you have the option to choose your own journey. You can choose a different silhouette based upon what you want to view. And then as you click on a silhouette, you get to see a content warning for some of this material. And so you might decide, okay, I don't want to see that right now. I want to go someplace else. You can also take these colored pencils and doodle all over the page. And that allows you, as you continue through the piece, because you can scroll to the right and see more and more, that we ask for more and more visual interaction from the audience, so that by the end of the piece, the audience is hopefully writing their own story. Of course, we're not capturing that story or keeping any information, it's all anonymous. But the whole idea is that if we can't speak out, and are afraid to talk about mental illness in our friends and our loved ones, in ourselves, then how is it that we actually are helping anybody? So how can we learn to use our voice by listening to 21 true stories of people using their voice to speak out? The other thing that I really am excited about is that as you move through the experience, and you'll see this little radio over here, and it interacts, you can interact with the radio, the sound design changes, and it changes based upon the order in which you move through the experience, and it changes based upon the timing of how you go through the experience. And also this little radio allows you, or will allow you, to click on it at the rate of your heartbeat, which also changes the sound design completely. So in a way, you are navigating the space and having the space respond to you so specifically to your interaction that it's almost impossible to replicate. Even if you were to go back in the same order, it would be very hard to keep the timing exactly the same. And so in that way, my hope is that the audience sees an idea of community, of shared time and space, just because they're in commune with these 21 different stories. And at the same time, their interaction is actually happening with the coding that is embedded in this experience to create something new and that's in response to them directly. And so that's where that's a trajectory of a lot of the digital work that I've been making. I've been making a ton of digital work. I've become a little bit addicted to it because, again, just going back to those early ideas, is what I have found in myself is, again, a sense of playfulness and a sense of myself and a sense of curiosity. And what has been also very, very interesting is that almost all of the pieces that I've worked on have been about the time we're in. So a lot of them have been about COVID. A lot of them have been about people's response to COVID. And I find that here in the US, we don't produce that quickly. We're not that nimble. And if a play is written about a time, you might not see it for another 5 or 10 years. And so I've really appreciated this great need, or maybe one of those essentials in the theater, is that we can, as practitioners, speak to the time. So it's been really great to actually be speaking to the time. Thank you.
Thank you, Elena. Wonderful. And there's some really interesting conversations happening in the chat here around gaming and theatre. And kind of like DIY aesthetics. So this is really, really interesting. So great discussions. And I was really interested in what you were saying around theatre in crisis and in emergency. I sometimes think that we're a little bit too comfortable with being in crisis all the time. It's a word I think I've always had associated with theatre throughout my life. But it always seems to be a place of solace as well, a place we go to in times of great crisis. So thank you. Definitely pick stuff up in the round table. So our last speaker is Joe Scott. Joe is an intermediate practitioner and lecturer in performance at the University of Salford. So thank you, Joe.
Thanks, Joe. And hello, everybody. Lovely to see you all here. And thank you so much to Harry and Elena. It's a pleasure to present alongside you and to hear about such fascinating work. So I will do the screen sharing. I'm going to turn my camera off. It's mainly just so you can focus on the sound and the voice. So I'll just do that. Oh, maybe I won't. Oh, no, I know how to do it. It's up here. There we go. Brill. Okay. So thanks very much to Joe and the DocPerform for inviting me to speak here today. And I wanted to focus on the implications of digital data exchanges occupying the center of the performance event, around which human activities and interventions circulate, and what it means for a primarily fleshed and physically co-present mode of art that makes use of a variety of technologies to be rehoused and centered within a networked computational space and to emanate from it. Concurrently, I am also interested in the modes of attention and engagement that have variously characterized my experience of online performances as an audience member in recent months. When performance happens online, there is a shuffling and repositioning of the elements of the event. The bodies are still there, and the technologies and materialities are also still there. But the relations between these elements shift fundamentally, and it's this shift that I think needs further consideration. So in preparing for today, I was struck by Joe's provocation to move beyond the liveness debate and into refreshed readings of where we are. I was also drawn towards reading performance through and as digital data, thinking in more detail about the audience as a data subject. And again, this was a provocation offered by Joe. So what I will attempt here is to start to map out the parameters for a data logical reading of online performance or internet theatre, and then mash that up with some experiences I have had within online performances as an audience member that reflect how hard I have found it to hold myself in the mode of attention that the work requires or wishes of me. A data subject, according to GDPR regulation, is any individual person who can be identified directly or indirectly via an identifier such as a name, an ID number, location data, or via factors specific to the person's physical, physiological, genetic, mental, economic, cultural, or social identity. In other words, a data subject is an end user whose personal data can be collected. The performance page won't load in my browser. There is a holding message, and the venue Twitter feed says they are experiencing technical difficulties. I mindlessly refresh the page over and over again, waiting for something to change. The piece is 40 minutes late in starting, but eventually we land with a performer on a stage in an empty auditorium in Berlin. He addresses us. He apologizes. The piece flips to other performers, some at home and some in public spaces. There are some beautifully choreographed moments with driving and moving light, but my attention is intermittent. Somehow duration and what it asks of me here is not working. I switch off and go and watch the telly. Lisa Blackman acknowledges that data is a vexed term and argues that a purely metric-based approach to understanding the data that emanates from us in networked spaces is limiting. Rather, she pursues an affective approach to data, paying attention to, quote, the traces of human, material, technical, symbolic, and imaginary histories that are often displaced and occluded in data metrics, end quote. And such an approach seems to me to be productive for addressing the audience member as a data subject within online performance spaces, and particularly that surplus of data that happens in such encounters, exceeding and escaping from the aesthetic frame of the event. Blackman reads data itself as a process of translation, which creates a use or surplus value from digital traces. And perhaps it is that play of value and values that is particularly heightened when live performance practices that already existed in data-soaked spaces, fully part of the economies of digital capitalism in their marketing, making, funding, and presentation, shift in a concerted way to exist inside and emanate from digital, coded, computational spaces. I haven't told my partner that I am attending a live, online, immersive sound experience from our bed. He always goes to sleep first anyway. I'm supposed to be alone on the right-hand side of the bed in a room with the door shut. Actually, I am next to my partner on the left-hand side of the bed with the door open and the cat at large somewhere despite the fact that the excesses of digital data in play in internet theatre are often obscured by the aesthetic event, this surplus can, of course, still be collected and used and processed and put to work as a commodity in the digital economy. As Shoshana Zuboff indicates, the human experience we feed into the network is treated as free raw material for translation into behavioural data, and its surplus becomes a hugely valuable commodity in what she calls behavioural futures markets. So, according to this argument, all the digital data that feeds into the central online performance and that which is produced by our watching, experiencing of, and interacting with this event can be extracted, claimed, valued, and sold. Equally, when performance occupies and emerges from a networked frame, it is through data points that we join, touch, and connect with it. Those bodily processes happening in leaking, wasteful, actual spaces where shreds of experience might just escape datafication and remain unused, dormant, dissolving, they now sit at the periphery of the central data event. It is an all-night, durational performance, and I want to go to bed. So I take the laptop into the bathroom and watch while I'm brushing my teeth. I am transfixed by a choreography of still life Zoom screens, a tiled image of views from windows and pockets of interiors, no faces. As soon as people start talking to me, I switch off and go to bed. So, following Clough et al., who outline a datalogical turn, I'm now really interested in a datalogical approach to addressing online or internet theatre and performance, which would pay attention to the representations of data that are offered through the performances, but also the actual unrepresentable but at present actualities of digital data happening as we engage with these experiences. Such an analysis would also address data as processes of translation following Blackman, perhaps how the data subject is identified and known within the piece, how data passes in and out of the body, and also the ways in which data exceeds the aesthetic frame, but also activity associated with the event exceeds the data frame, the surplus or noise which it creates. The performance happens in my bathroom through an app on my phone and is a sonic instruction-based work. It asks me to complete certain actions while listening to audio. And I do some of them, but not others. Some just don't seem possible, and others I choose not to do. I don't feel like a data subject. I don't feel processed and exploited and exchanged and calculated. I'm too busy negotiating as to whether I will or won't offer to this work what it asks of me. So in conclusion, what's emerging so far in my thinking about the current repositioning of performance practices in online, computational, network spaces is two concurrent but quite diverse perspectives. And one prompts me to address the actual workings of digital data in the event, its excesses, surpluses, and modes of representation, translation, and exchange. The other turns to the practical and felt negotiations that are always happening between me and the remote online event as I encounter it, which clearly represent new modes of experience and attention, but also perhaps different parameters for reading and understanding spectatorship in and of performance. And that's bibliography. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Jo. Wonderful. Extraordinarily evocative of the kind of void space of data. Thank you, Joe, and thank you to all of our panel. So 3 fantastic papers. So if I could ask everyone to come on camera now, please. Great. So we'll talk for just a little while, and then if people can keep on asking questions, if you could post any specific questions in the Q&A, then I'm more likely to pick it up. But do click, this is a wonderful chat, and all of you, all our panel, you've been seeing wonderful compliments, so please do take some time to read them. I'm just wondering if we could just start, perhaps, if any of you have a question for each other, inspired by your papers. Joe, yeah?
Just playing by the rules here, putting them down. Yeah, I've got a few actually, but I've got one for Elena and one for Harry, but I'll start with Elena, and then please feel free to move on to somebody else. I'm just really interested in this intersection of the crafted material, homemade element of the pieces and the kind of quite high-tech nature of how you're activating, particularly that final piece that you showed us, which just looked fantastic. I'd love to see it. I was wondering, I mean, you talked very much about what those offer to you in terms of this notion of theatre magic and bringing that, but how have you found bringing together that kind of sense of the crafted and the material with the technology, and could you talk a little bit about that process?
Yeah, I think what's amazing about the crafted, handmade perspective is that it really does invite that mimetic imagination, that we really are saying, okay, these are not real hands, these are straws with some paper on them, and yet it invites us as an audience to bring our imagination into it. And what I'm particularly interested in always on a real stage or in digital stage or an internet stage is I really believe that we invite the audience's imagination into the conversation by what we don't show them. Mm-hmm. And so when you start to use this gaming technology or animation or any kind of digital visual, I was actually working with a coder on Farm for Meme, and he said, what's amazing about a digital space is that I can make anything. Said, if you can imagine it, I can make it. The technology is so good that you can put yourself into fantasy. You can put yourself, not necessarily always realistically. I mean, cartoons, they still look like cartoons to me, you know, but you can put yourself into any space that you can imagine. And so for me, what the real question is what am I not showing the audience to continue to invite that imagination? And so in Alice in the Pandemic, we were toggling between the reality of the situation, this woman who's an essential worker just in her bedroom, and then the fantastical or dreamlike world, which is this digital world. And at the same time, I never wanted to lose sight that you were still supposed to see these avatars as just puppets. So that's why the singers were always there. We were never trying to devoid the real performance or the behind the scenes person holding the strings. And in fact, I did another piece recently, which I didn't show today, which was a commedia piece based on the work of Juan Rana, the great commedia actor from the Spanish Golden Age. And the performer, who was using synesthesia, a program to data mosh all of these pictures and basically to make the pictures look like paintings. And he was doing that live while we had one camera on his hands manipulating the data moshing through sound and movement, and then at the same time another camera actually allowing us to see what the data moshing looked like. And so for me, I do think that I don't want to get away from playfulness, and for me, I never want to forget that we're in a theater. I don't believe that when we go to a theater space, we are ever so wrapped up in a performance that we forget that we are in a theater. I like seeing the constructs of the theater. I like acknowledging that our imagination can go so far, and yet we're still reminded that we're maybe sitting next to a stranger. And so I still try to keep the trappings of the proscenium arch. Obviously, we can't forget, you know, that you see this, but you're going to see the rest of your house too. So how is it that we invite you in to focus in by what we're not giving you and by seeing the backstage all the time? Sorry, it's a long-winded answer as I was trying to work it out.
No, it's fascinating. I was talking to, and just on that, I mean, I was talking to students today about how whilst we have platforms like Instagram and Facebook, which are inherently performative anyway, you're always curating a version of your life and a version of your identity. What artists really need to do, it seems to me, is to lift up the bonnet, and as you were saying, Elena, like show the mechanics of how this works, and we can't do that with these platforms. And so you have to kind of, you know, create space where the imagination is able to fill some of the void, or to use platforms where you're exceeding the kind of limitations of affordances of the interface, which is what theatre is always doing, because it's the language of metaphor.
There was a lot of conversation in the chat about gaming and this gaming theater. There's a really wonderful piece put on by Celine Song that happened through New York Theater Workshop. And I don't know that you can view it live anymore or view it anymore, but she used that game Sims, the Sims in, yeah, I don't know enough about gaming. And she basically created the Seagull or the Cherry Orchard, one of the Chekhov pieces.
One of the Chekhovs.
With the Sims. And there was no script. She wasn't using the script. She just knew the characters, knew their qualities, knew the plot, and was creating live the piece. So she's a playwright. She was playwriting this adaptation of the Chekhov piece. And at the same time, the audience is promoting the next version of the plot, the next thing that's happening through the chat. And anytime she you know, ends up getting knocked off the internet, everyone responds, right? Trying to get her back on. To me, the chat has become the new way of either throwing tomatoes at the performers or cheering them on. And so I do think that people are using this technology in a way that's theatrical.
Yeah. And Lynn Hirschman-Leeson also, I'm not sure if she did this, but a version of her piece, Roberta Brightmore, was also created on Second Life. So there seems to be just a sense of sort of revival of sort of interest in Web 1.0, a little bit more sort of a two-dimensional, you know, internet, before social media, pre-social media, when the web was a little bit more of a Wild West. Would anyone else got any questions for each other, or to respond to, or just to join in with this conversation?
It's just to pick up what Elena was saying, and I suppose I'm doing this thing where I'm trying to draw a link. So if it doesn't quite like work, then just tell me to shut up. But
put you in the breakout room of shame.
But yeah, exactly. But it feels like, so Elena, you were talking about theatre magic, and I suppose that makes me think of illusion. But then maybe that's not quite. Maybe that's not quite right, because when I hear you talking about like revealing behind the scenes, that feels a much more kind of Brechtian mode of working, I guess, which was all about, you know, exposing the illusion, I guess. And I feel like, yeah, there's something, you're right, Joe, about we don't get to see the behind the scenes of the technology. Like we just see the interface. And so I think work that exposes that, or, you know, I'm thinking of the post-digital and thinking about glitches and things like that, where you're suddenly, through theatre and performance, you're able to see the kind of limitations of the technology, or it's no longer an illusion because the medium becomes very present, or something like that. And I wonder how that links to the kind of datalogical reading, Joe. And I don't know, because I think I'd really love to read your text, because I think I'd get loads from it. But yeah, maybe my question to you, Joe, would be, is your inability to kind of meet these works at the level they're asking of you or something, is that some kind of like resistant reading of data, or I don't know, those are the links I'm trying to make, but that was just a bit of a kind of mind splurge, so sorry.
I think there absolutely is a link between I mean, it's this whole idea of the opacity of quite a lot of this media generally, you know, that we tend to view it and see it and experience it through interfaces that don't reveal its workings. And generally you have to be an expert, or to some extent an expert, to be able to intersect and interact with it in terms of what it's doing. And I've become more and more fascinated, as somebody who loves the theatrical event when it reveals its construction and enjoys both watching the result of technology and performance and somebody telling me or revealing to me how that technology is working in some way. It's kind of that duality of the construction of the thing and the thing that it's making, which, you know, like Katie Mitchell's multimedia type of work does a lot, you know, so they'll construct the image, they'll put the thing on the face of the performer and you'll see the wind blowing, and then you'll see the beautiful image that creates. So I love that. But I think it is a lot more difficult within these kinds of spaces to really prize that open. And I suppose what I've become more and more interested in is what happens if you really try to do that. Does it reveal anything that is interesting or important or significant? It might not, to be honest. I mean, I haven't really had a go at doing this yet. I'm just thinking I want to. And it's more to do with this frustration with exactly the thing that Joe was saying about never being able to look under the bonnet, or never feeling like you have that access to the workings of the event. But to be honest, in terms of the question, that's very, very separate from my bad audiencing, which really is to do with losing myself, my sense of self as an audience member, I feel, in this kind of hybrid context. So that, you know, when I am positioned within a space and I feel like I have responsibility to whoever else is there and to the artist who is asking me to do things, or indeed is asking of my attention, then I feel much more able, I guess, to offer that. And when I am in this space and there are other things competing, and I consume the work, I think, in a very, very different kind of way because of the habits of consumption I have with my screens, then I think that all mitigates against me feeling, it's not that I'm not able, but feeling willing, I suppose, to really offer a sense of commitment as an audience member. That's what I've found, you know. I've kind of wanted to do that, but I've also not necessarily really carried that through, that wish. And you know, I am a good audience member usually, so that's what I'm interested in, is why is that flipped so much? And I think there's loads of reasons for that, but yeah, that's not me being resistant to the data, because, you know, I'm kind of like in that duality that we're all in, where it's like, I know this shit is happening, but I'm still engaging with all of the stuff that you know, feeds into it. So yeah,
I wonder if it's to do with the need to sort of following this idea of magic, theatre magic, the need to some extent escape, and that we know at some level we're always surrounded by data. It's always being exchanged. It's always being sold. We're always being manipulated by it. We're always gaining great pleasure from it. And so when we go into a performance, perhaps there's a resistance, and perhaps it is a political resistance to theatricalizing that, or to saying that, like, you know, don't like, or trying to kind of, what's the word I'm looking for, kind of enjoy the simulation when so much of our life is already becoming more simulated. I don't know if any of the panel have seen the new documentary, A Glitch in the Matrix. And it's, so I see on the chat here, there's talk about glitches being what makes something live or alive. I would definitely go with that. And that's kind of what the documentary is saying, that when we notice the mistakes of tech, we're suddenly realizing that the simulation that we kind of are immersed within it's a tear in the curtain. You know, it's suddenly saying, oh right, yes, there is something going on behind this, and that we can experience and seeing those glitches makes us aware of our own simulated perspectives, I guess, which in an era of lockdown is most of what we get when we're at home, that we're only ever simulating the real world.
There's this really wonderful, and I'll pull up his name, Italian Instagram content creator who's an illusionist. And I was thinking about this idea of when do we want illusion, and actually magic shows have been doing really well in a virtual context. And when do we want to see the makings of theatricality? And he is in a way able to do both. And he has this wonderful Instagram post where he's standing in front of a green screen, basically, that's creating a two-dimensional background, but which really looks, of course, like a three-dimensional background. And then what he does is he rubs this green paste on his face, which blends his three-dimensional body into the two-dimensional background, which looks like a three-dimensional background. So in and of itself, he's sort of saying, look, when I didn't have this green paste on my face, I look like I'm a part of a three-dimensional world. And at the same time, I'm destroying the illusion and reminding you that we're all just in a two-dimensional world. And there's just a wonderful, I think, conversation that he's having in just such a simple way. And in terms of glitches, I spend now, I mean, I've done like 6 or 7 virtual pieces and have 3 or 4 more in pre-production and production right now. And I spend most of my tech time, which is all the time, creating the screen that says we are having technical difficulties, be back in a minute. Because I have found that people love the glitches because it makes them go, oh, it's alive, it's real, is it going to come back? Oh my God, they're going to fail. Oh my gosh, no, they're going to succeed, they're back. And it's this terrifying adrenaline filled moment when you're the one helping to manipulate, or you're texting with your playwright and your stage manager, and it goes down because you're somehow, you know, at the mercy of the internet Wi-Fi gods, that you're reminded somehow of the humanity and the limits of this human invention. And I always make sure my little Be Back Soon slides are animated so that people don't think they're stuck in a frozen screen and never going to get out. Yeah. And so in the same way that in a preview and a performance, you know, there's always that option that the stage manager will say, hold please, we have to fix something. And that's why people go to preview. So I think there's something really interesting in glitches.
Yeah. And I think Brett provides a good perspective on that, the alienation, the defamiliarizing of the technology, which we're just saturated by. And when you're trying to make it do something, it's not, or you're using it in a slightly unusual way, then the new glitches will emerge. You know, I wonder if we could just go. We've got quite a few questions, so I wonder if there was one here. Yes, so one question from Josh. How many of the new techniques that have been discussed today are going to be around post-COVID? Do you think there'll be a wider uptake of digital practice, or will we revert back to pre-COVID practices? Anyone like to take that?
I think that once we've opened this door, it's going to stay open. And the reason being is, I think the unfortunate side of it is that theaters in the US will see digital theater as a form of marketing, that suddenly you can reach a wider audiences. All of the big theaters in the US are already converting their stages to sound stages, to multi-camera angle stages. So we can do things like either what the Metropolitan Opera is doing already with live streaming or streaming in movie theaters, but also as a way to invite audiences in a different way. I also think that, so for example, Farm for Meme, which is the first piece that I did, It was 20 minutes long. We only had 4 performances. Those were the 2 in English and 2 in Spanish. And we partnered with an organization, a handful of organizations. And one of the organizations supports queer people of color in the state of Texas. And one of their largest populations that they help serve are trans people fleeing Central America and seeking asylum in the United States. And they work with these people and help these people. And it was really important to them, this organization, that if we were going to partner with them, we were making this accessible in every way possible to everyone that they serve, all the kinds of artists and people that they serve. That's why we had ASL interpretation that was done live. That's why we did it in English and Spanish, because some of the people that they were helping to come from Latin America are monolingual and not literate in either language. So we couldn't just do English with Spanish subtitles, because that was a kind of a barrier to an audience. And so suddenly, you know, our first performance, we saw 2,000 audience members from 11 different countries. And that just wouldn't happen in a New York City theater scene. So I think that theaters will find their way to capitalize on what digital theater can bring.
Mm.
Yeah, and I think that a lot of what is happening at the moment will continue in some form or another. I also think that it will be really interesting when we start to have that intersection between what's happening in a purely internet and digital way, and then when spaces start to open, and what creative kind of uses of spaces with tech and with distancing will happen. And I think that's a really exciting hybrid, actually, you know, so that the idea that quite a lot of theatres probably won't be going back to big auditorium pieces immediately. They will have to think inventively about how their spaces are occupied and operate, and perhaps we'll start to have that double audience thing happening quite a lot, you know, so whereby you have a present kind of set of audience, but also an accessible kind of way for people to see work or experience it or interact with it digitally as well. So yeah, I mean, I think that I agree with Elena. I can't see the door being opened in this way and then shutting completely. But I also think that there will start to be this set of hybrid things happening in terms of how, you know, the types of technologies that people have become more familiar and more creative and with in this moment, then intersect with sites and spaces and bodies in other ways as well. And of course, that was already happening before, wasn't it? There's so many examples of mixed reality work and cyberperformance and things that were already in play. It's just the acceleration, I suppose, that we're really trying to catch up with at this point, aren't we?
Yeah, this work has been around for a really long time, and people have been doing this in really exciting ways. At least in the US, they've been sort of in a marginal place, closer to performance art and not necessarily in theater. And now suddenly they're the people that we need. They're the people that whose ability with this kind of work is really important. And now suddenly it's the only option. And so theaters are paying attention. I also think that in the US, what we're starting to see is ideas of tiered seating. So you can buy an orchestra seat, you can buy a mezzanine seat, you can buy a balcony seat, or you can buy a virtual seat. And so this is why all these theaters are creating these multi-camera, you know, ways of doing things. And whether that's good or bad, I don't know. But I do know that virtual theater has been capturing an audience that, at least in the US, we have not been able to capture. Our theater audience tends to be older, tends to be white. And so how else can this work help others feel invited in different ways?
Yeah, it's interesting, that tiered thing. The new RSC Dream Online, you can watch for free, or you can buy a £10 ticket that is an interactive ticket, but it's not clear what that will get you, or what mode of interaction, or what kind of, but I thought that distinction is quite an interesting one, isn't it? You're either a passive watcher and you can watch it for free, or you're somebody who might have some kind of role within it, or you're able to interact with it in some way. So yeah, those kinds of gradations, I suppose, might come into play more.
Yeah, go on, Harry. Yeah.
No, I was just going to say, interestingly, the Traverse Theatre in Edinburgh have developed this strand of their program called Traverse 3, or Trav3 maybe, which is, they've got two spaces, Traverse 1, Traverse 2, and so they've developed Trav3 as kind of online work, which predominantly I think has been kind of short films and kind of theatre made for remade for film, but they've done like a couple of 360 documentaries, 360 video documentaries and things like that, and they're planning to continue that strand of the program. So just one example of a theatre who are planning already to do that. And I guess the NT at home stuff as well, which has now become, it's a shame it didn't just become available on YouTube again. Like it's like another form of tiered, like why not just make it accessible to everyone?
Yeah.
But obviously theatres have to think about income as well at the moment, particularly at the moment. But I suppose a more radical version of NT at home would have been for them to just put one up every month and keep your audiences engaged that way. But yeah, I can see why you might need to also kind of have an income stream at the moment.
Yeah, I think it's definitely, well, it showed us the limitations of the economic models of theatre. We're still bums on seats, and without that, you're going to stay closed. And there does seem to have been a few missed opportunities as well. There was one theatre that limited the number. It was an online show, but they limited the number of people, and it's like it was exactly the same number of people that the auditorium could cope with. It's like, this is just crazy level of emulation. And this issue, I didn't know about the RSC, but this thing about sort of different tiered audiences, sort of, as in sort of like enhanced audiences and secondary audiences. It feels like a really unnecessary replication of things that are wrong with in-person, face-to-face theatre, particularly immersive and participatory work, where it's so expensive. You have a class of audiences who get it and are very familiar with what the rules are. But this issue of accessibility is one that has, it's one I've been thinking about in terms of the digital divide as well, because, I think it's easy, yes, at one level, of course, if people can't physically go to a theatre in terms of physical barriers or economic barriers, but then there is a sizable portion of the UK who do not have internet access, and it seems to be one that I'm not sure how that problem is going to be alleviated anytime soon, because one of the many inequalities COVID has revealed, that if you aren't online, then you are completely invisible. You do not have any presence. I just want to pick up another question around this, about well-being. Oh, sorry. It's from Persephone. Is there research evidence to support the impact of digital theatre/arts on the well-being and health of individuals and communities?
There is a lot of research about social media addiction, internet addiction, interactivity addiction, gaming addiction. I don't know. I think, theater, virtual theater, internet theater, though it has been going on for a long time, is still kind of a new trend. And I don't know if there's necessarily enough information about it or research about it, but I know that my eyes hurt a lot, and I'm aging much faster than I would be because I spend my day sitting in front of a computer.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know about specific research around that, but it makes me think of some of the other kinds of work that theatres are doing at the moment that we haven't really discussed, because they wouldn't be classed as internet theatre, but where they're kind of redirecting their focus towards their local communities, I guess. So some examples I can think of are Slung Low in Leeds, who've done loads of brilliant work, like since the pandemic, not only like creating outdoor performance events, but also actually like supporting the community by becoming a food bank essentially. Also Eden Court in Inverness kind of repurposed all of their staff to work for the council to support kind of COVID relief stuff. So it's completely not internet theatre, but I think it's it would be classed as like lockdown activity of theatres, I think, where if you can't engage with your audiences through the artwork, then how can you support them in other ways and their well-being, community, etc., etc. I think it's forced a lot of us to think about this situation. Has forced a lot of us to think about what the role of a theatre venue is in our communities, I think, and some have responded to that in more like direct action ways than others.
I also think that there's a lot of what I'm excited about this time is yes, there's a lot of digital divide, and I don't think theater, because it costs money, will ever be 100% democratic as much as we might want it to be. But I do think that what is really interesting is the new types of audiences we're getting. So in the United States, a couple of years ago, there was a big survey done, and only 2% of the American population goes to the theater regularly. And by regularly, they mean they see 2 plays a year or 2 theater performances a year. And so it's a really, really small audience. And, during Alice in the pandemic, and, this is completely anecdotal, but we had 2 types of audience members, those who were there for the opera and those who were there for the animation and the knowing some of the gamers who made the piece. And it was astounding. The opera singers are in the chat, the opera audience is in the chat saying things like, oh my gosh, her voice is so rich. I can't believe how she hit that note. It's just so beautiful. I love this aria. And then you've got gamers saying, oh my God, look at how fast that thing's moving. And then at one point, this gamer who was very active in chat finally said, do you think that the opera singers are improvising the words, or is this memorized? And I was like, these 2 worlds are getting smashed together in a way that they never would have anyplace else. And through the chat, I'm learning about gaming, people are learning about opera. And I find that so exciting. And in a way, though we're still sharing space and time with a stranger, just like we would in a theater.
Yeah. And I think gaming communities are more used to that level of interactivity than theatre audiences are. They might share the same space, but actually sharing, swapping. Actually, it's happening in the chat. I mean, I love academic events. You always get a reading list as you leave. There's loads of links there. But no, it's wonderful. I mean, it's genuinely wonderful, and I love it. And there's a comment here. Theatre might also have to deal sooner or later with the phenomena of interpassivity. In video games, it's there already. This is why so many of us are watching rather than playing. Question for Elena. How did you achieve the lip sync performance? That's from Tessa.
Our sound engineer actually invented a new process, and it is currently being patented. I'm working on 2 other pieces with him using that same technology. And I think we're going to go up to 4 singers on the next opera with that. And it does require a live sound engineer. There are a couple of softwares like Audio Movers, which can help you sync to a track or to a click track. And they work very, very well. And we actually rehearse on that sometimes when he can't be there to live stream and mix for volume. But I actually can tell you how he does it exactly, but I can tell you his name, and he's really great. And hopefully this will be something that he can disseminate more easily soon.
Great, thank you. And a question for Joe. What does Joe think is the role of the encouraged watch party? Is there perhaps a sense that it is controlled inattention, setting boundaries within which the audience is permitted to stray?
So I think, let me just make sure I get this right. An encouraged watch party would be like a live gathering around a piece where you are being prompted to watch it together with others, right?
Gemma, do you want to quickly write in the chat? Is that right? Maybe Gemma's left. Oh, yes. Yeah, she's saying yes, like a tweet along. Yeah.
I quite like that notion, Gemma, of controlled inattention. Yeah, I like that, because I think that the thing that I struggled with, and to be clear, you know, all of the things that I have engaged with, I've found a lot in. It's just that I've been disappointed in myself, and I think that kind of reflection on audiencing has been what's come out of this for me. But the idea of controlled inattention, i.e. that there are parameters that are permeable, perhaps, within what that offers, a loose framework within which you are there, you're present, you can interact to a certain extent, the work is there, it's on for a certain amount of time, you know you're watching it with people. It's like Harry's ice cube to a certain extent, you know, there's something happening that you can connect to other people and share in that way, but there is not necessarily that expectation of a full-on mode of very, very concentrated attention. That seems to me to be, quite a nice in-between from some of the things that I was reflecting on, I suppose, which were not live pieces, but were live broadcast. So they were happening in a particular time. I had to be present at a time to experience them. And but it's very, very different, I think, having that sense of others being in that broadcast, unless that's activated in some way, I suppose, through the kind of thing that you're suggesting. So yeah, I mean, I do quite like the idea of frameworks that are looser and more permeable, and there's some controlling of the inattention, and I feel like that again is something that has been played with quite a lot. I don't know though, I don't know whether everybody else has this experience. There is something about how chat sometimes works in live broadcast work that can be quite difficult really, in terms of how it operates in relation to the central thing. If it's not directed in any way, or if it's not positioned in any way in relation to the central work, then you do have this kind of parallel universe happening. And sometimes that's great and you can really engage with it. And sometimes it's just like, So clearly, if that's fine, if you're okay with that as a maker to have that happening, then that's okay. But sometimes I think I like it when the performance really just draws that in a little bit more to what it's doing, so that there feels like there is some kind of conversation between those. They're not just two lines running, you know, alongside each other. So I think chat's really, like Elena was saying, you know, there's something really interesting about how chat generally is being used within these kinds of works, whether they're live works that are happening or whether they're things that are being broadcast and then we're being asked to engage with them in a kind of watch along kind of way.
Did you want to come? Oh, sorry, go on, Elena. Yeah.
Your concern about not being a good audience member is something that I also experience in the theater itself. I mean, how many times am I thinking about something else that I've got to be doing or something I should be doing while I'm watching a piece of theater? And I think that in and out is kind of amazing. And I love this phrase, controlled inattention, because in a theater, you're controlled just because you have a seat and it's hard to get out of it. And in you know, and in the same way that my mind might wander in the theater, I can do my laundry at the same time as I'm watching a show. And so I'm curious as to how we capitalize upon that as opposed to try to limit it. And I'm thinking about attention spans and what that does and what our expectations are for a screen. What I really love about this kind of work and where I'm learning so much to hopefully take back into the theater, you know, at least in the US, when I'm in a theater room, we don't talk about emotion, we talk about action. When I'm working in opera, we don't talk about action, we talk about emotion. Or I try to get them to talk about action sometimes. And when I'm working with these gamers, you know, we were working on this Bunny Rabbit's aria in Alice in the Pandemic. And it was, you know, first set with him just sitting sadly, this rabbit, singing the sad song. And I just thought, oh my God, this is so beautiful. It's like so sad. This poor little bunny is so sad. And the gamers were like, he's not moving, he's got to move. You can't watch this thing not move, it has to move, everyone's going to get bored. And so their idea of capturing an audience's imagination is about speed and cuts and how fast and how long can an audience sit before something else has to get their attention. I'm not saying that's good or bad. I like in the theater that we get to sit, that we get to breathe, but I'm also very aware that there are generations younger than me that have a very different experience about attention span, have been brought up in a different way. And so, yeah, I don't think we should beat ourselves up if we're not great audiences right now.
Yeah, and I agree. And I don't think it's, I think that I agree with you on the sense of sitting down and watching a work, that you're right, you move in and out of it, and that's a lovely thing. You know, you can feel yourself being drawn in, and then you can feel your attention wander. I think the thing that I found more challenging is being works that have asked something directly of me, where I've not been able to fulfill that. And I think that's when I'm aware of the distinction between myself as a participatory, you know, audience member, somebody who is in the presence of the work and follows its kind of edicts, because I know that that's what is expected of me. I also know that that's what will get the most interesting experience for me, and so perhaps that's the divide that I felt more keenly in terms. But I do think that you're right. I think that it isn't necessarily about defaulting to the types of attention we would expect within certain types of cinema, or indeed certain types of gaming practice, and sometimes playing with very singular, simple things like Oliver Zahn's piece, Harry, that I also saw and loved, and things like Joe Bannon's work that I think you mentioned when we talked before, was beautiful kind of audio essay of 12 parts, so simple, like, you know, in terms of it is just somebody telling you stuff. It's a text, it's but really, really engaging nonetheless for that. And I don't think, yeah, that there isn't need to default because of the attention deficit necessarily, but I do think it's interesting to consider how we how that mode of consumption shifts in your home environment, in your domestic space, and also in relation to screens and apps and devices. So yeah.
Do you want to comment, Harry?
Yeah, I mean, just to say, I was thinking about the kind of interactivity, I suppose, and the best, or not the best, but the kind of most enjoyable live stream theatre show I've seen in the last year was Shit Theatre's Shit Actually. I don't know if anyone saw that, but it was a sort of a pastiche of Love Actually as a Christmas show streamed from home Manchester. And there was a very light interactive element, which was a WhatsApp chat had been set up alongside the show. And there were very specific moments where, you know, you were invited to contribute, or a couple of participants were invited to do something in the house, like go and get an instrument and play something on the instrument or something like that. So it was very directed. It wasn't running alongside and as much as what you've described, Joe, but for me that worked really well. But also, you know, there was a sense of an event about it, possibly because it was a Christmas show as well. Like, has that build up, and you like have to get a glass of wine and a biscuit, and I can't remember all the things you have to get, but you have to sort of prepare all these things before you sit down and watch it. And you know, a lot of the online theatre I've seen, like live streamed theatre, I've been and because I have kids at home as well, I've been sort of like logging on at bedtime, like holding a baby, not really in the right zone to watch something like 2 minutes before it's about to start or whatever. So I think certainly, I suppose what happens in the theatre is that you, and this is a term that's used in VR context, is that you go on a kind of onboarding experience through, you know, traveling to the theatre, arriving at the theatre, picking up your ticket, whatever program, getting a drink, however it works, you kind of travel into a space where your attention works differently, I think. And if if an online work or an internet work or and sort of online experience can do that kind of onboarding or easing you into the experience, I have found that I'm much more receptive to the work as a result of that.
Yeah.
So and Joe Bannon's piece, I suppose it doesn't do that before you experience it, but it does it through the piece. It kind of it guides you into that space of reflection, I guess, or immersion, we might call it as well. But that's an audio piece, so it's slightly different as well. It's because you don't have to watch something. Although there's a video version of it, actually, I should say. I chose to experience it on headphones, so you can. It's I don't know. I think headphone theatre is a different mode of attention again.
Yeah, it sounds like from the discussion that why this works for me is so exciting, because we are in uncharted territory. Because yes, there is so much. There is a history of internet theatre and online work, cyber performance, as has been said. But there's something about, lockdown has just sort of intensified this experience of being a constant audience to a screen and having to interact with a screen so much that it just feels that we have to get into a new mode of seeing the screen, which emulation doesn't seem to cut it for all kinds of reasons, not least because we're in domestic space, or if it's on something on the phone, then we're outside and there's so much. And so having to sort of reconfigure our perceptual apparatus, it's a complex task. I have no idea how to go about it, but it feels like all of these pieces are training us in some way, or they're experiments in training new ways of seeing as well as experiencing the digital. I can't resist this. Sorry, it's just something that Harry was saying, or has been said about the this watch along thing, because that's become a sort of like subgenre of lockdown. And I do love it. I love getting together on WhatsApp and watching a film. The chat is more fun than the film. But I don't know if anyone has listened to the podcast, My Dad Wrote a Porno. It's absolutely hilarious. It's these three people, they're old university friends, and one of their dads has written this ridiculous porno novel, and they read bits of it and then talk about it. And this fusion of commentary and piece and text. It's beautifully simple, but I'm wondering, no other medium but a podcast could do that. And they do live shows. And I think it looks a bit, might be frustrating. They're reading, then they're talking, but being in that kind of sonic universe allows for these different registers of audiencing and of performing. It's so much. I mean, podcast theatre for me, that's a really exciting idea. I'm sure it will happen. So I'm just
respond with one thing.
Yeah.
For the question, I think that this idea that we should go to the theater or view something on our screen without moving and staying there and watching it is which is of course us just trying to replicate when we do what we do in the theater. And I think we have to always remember that is a very Western centric idea of how to view theater. I love going to see my family in South America and seeing street theater and theater even inside, where you get up and walk away if you don't like it. And that's just part of the experience. Or you get up and walk away to make a phone call and you come back. A lot of the theater that I experienced in China is very much the same thing. So this idea that we sit down, we be quiet, we don't make any noise, we just receive the information that you're supposed to give us, and then it's done, I think is a limited perspective on or definition that I always have to remind myself to shake myself out of. And so I am interested in how digital theater can expand upon ideas of form and structure, and then also ideas of plays that have been happening over telephone, there's been so many amazing telephone pieces. There's this one called Baby Jessica's Well-Made Play that was made by a small New York City theater company. And what they do is the day before you see the show or you hear the show, you have to build your own set. And they ask you to build like a play fort, like a dark, soft fort that you're closed in, maybe in a closet. And then you get on the phone and you are interviewed by somebody and you perceive the plot through the interview. And then the next day you become the interviewer and you interview a stranger in the same manner. And so in a lot of ways it's a story, but you're in a space. You might stay in that space for a long period of time. They force you to somehow have that attention because you're on the phone and it's rude to just hang up on somebody on the phone. And you are invited to participate when you become the performer the next day. And so I think people are doing really, really interesting things with audio.
Yeah.
Of course, Audible has an entire series now of audio plays, which of course we all have been around forever, but there is definitely a resurgence happening.
Yeah, and there's pieces, this is pre-lockdown, but a piece like Karen last Theory's app-based performance, which again, it's just the app, you know, as a form that kind of sort of flows into your everyday, that you're not time bound, and that is the performance. Most of it exists on servers that you can't have access to. It's the data that you're giving it, and Last Theory control that. And I was talking to students again about this today, Karen, and I was saying that, yes, Karen, someone got asked, yes, but is it theatre? And actually, in the last 15 minutes, we shouldn't dance around the killer question, and Imogen's asked it. At what point does the digital nature of a performance move it from theatre to film? The pandemic has certainly blurred this line. In other words, we can ask, is any of this stuff really theatre? And I was talking to this student and saying, they were asked, I don't really know if it's theatre because it just feels so real. And I was like, that's a fair question, because I've got a running app and I talk to Erin, and Erin tells me about when she moved to Boston and she started running, and like how she's got this mantra, and I was like, I don't even know if Erin is a real human being. She might be a bot. And this is just an everyday thing people were downloading, using, and there is something quite theatrical in the kind of digital identities that we're always encountering and interacting with. And so I'll just give a quick response to Imogen's questions. From my point of view, is this theatre or film? I love work that's in the grey spaces. I think it's really exciting because that's when we're forced to reappraise our own assumptions and beliefs about what the limitations of a particular art form are. And the reason I open with those quotes from Michael Cousteau, because when I read that book when I was a student in sort of early 2000s, I was absolutely with him. I was like, absolutely, yeah, theatre's got to resist it. It's about ritual, it's about presence and dance and the event, and yeah, we've got to strip it back. And you know, it was all about, I was being taught at Exeter, which was all very Kwiatkowski, psychophysical acting. And I read it now and I just think, God, how far we've come. And yes, it is, as someone said, the Phelan Allsland debate, but even more broadly, you could talk about this. Live art has this conversation all the time, you know, and live artists sometimes explicitly reject the label of theatre because they're like, I don't have the trappings of that. I don't want to say I'm a director or a playwright. I'm just an artist who wants to make some work. And I work with this medium for this piece and that technology for that piece. So I am very comfortable talking about this word theatre because I think that it is ultimately an encounter between bodies, and whether they're in the same physical space or not, I still want to believe it's a form that we've not yet reached the sort of final form of yet, that it can be reopened to reinvention as it has been for millennia. But I'll throw that question to our panel. Internet theatre, film or theatre, something else?
I used to, when I started this process of trying to make this work in the beginning of the pandemic, I was really obsessed with that binary. And it came out of this place of, well, theater is essential. People need to come to the theater. So how do I prove that? And how do I prove that theater is different than film and television? And I'm less interested in that binary right now. I'm more interested in what we can learn from filmic techniques from audio techniques. And I'm also really fascinated by how other medium have taken up some theater practices. There's a whole ton of fashion houses that are using marionettes and puppets to do their runway shows because they can't have live models. And so to puppeteer this couture fashion as it goes across a virtual runway, I think is an astounding way of them borrowing from us. So, you know, we should borrow from them. I also think the difference with film and you know, everything's a little loosey-goosey right now, but film, you can pause and you can come back. And in a live theater, you don't just get to come back. You know, you've missed something, and you might choose to miss it, but you're still missing something. So I think that the idea of shared time is important in that conversation.
Yeah, Joe's not so sure.
No, I absolutely think that in the types of works that you're describing, Elena, and I absolutely agree, you know, theatrical devices and have been adopted by other kinds of practitioners, and that shared time definitely can be a marker, but it definitely is not the way in which quite a lot of the pieces that I've engaged with have worked. I have been able to pause them and I have been able to come back to them. And yet I would still broadly think of them as, I would say, online performance rather than internet theatre. I suppose I do kind of think of the expanded term of performance in terms of things like game-like theatre, creative walking practices, you know, those kinds of works that have these elements of them which we might link to an act of performance or an event or a happening or a moment, but don't necessarily have the kind of definitions of shared time and space. But I do think that, like you'd said, Joe, when we had our initial discussion, people are not necessarily using the word theatre and they're using other words. I found it fascinating that Dante or Die called User Not Found a Video podcast, for instance. And I didn't really know why they called it that, or what was the purpose of characterizing the work in that way. For me, it felt like a piece of online performance, even though it was pre-recorded and it was a video on YouTube. There was still something about it that activated a live experience for me that made me connect it more to performance than I would to pre-recorded media such as film. So yeah, loosey-goosey is about where we're at. I agree with Elena, and that I think I certainly am more interested, like you are, Joe, in the expansion and the shifting than I am in trying to put lines around this and say this is and this isn't. So yeah.
Yeah, and I don't mean to suggest that, you know, pre-recorded stuff is not theater, but I also I agree. Why are we working so hard to keep theater the way it was? Yeah. Which is a problem not just in digital theater, but in theater.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm trying to formulate a response, but obviously, you know, a year at National Theatre of Scotland wasn't long enough to to answer that question. Is it theatre or not? But I think in the works that I've talked about today, and in Joe Bannon's work, which was also pre-recorded, it's not necessarily about shared time, but about an awareness of time. I don't know where I'm going with this. I think what's useful for me is the kind of idea of performativity, actually, and that some of this work is pitched towards that kind of point of reception, and some of it is not so much, you know, and I find it really hard to kind of unpick this really, and to put clear boundaries between works. But there was something about of the dramaturgy of Joe Bannon's piece where it's addressed to a listener in the future, and that's like written into the structure of the text as well as the concept of the listening experience, I suppose. And so I don't really know what the answer is, but but certainly things that I've gravitated towards have been works that set up a kind of encounter, whether that's in a shared space and time or not. And I think that, I don't know if that's how we would want to define theatre. That probably feels a bit too broad. But certainly I'm happy to talk about a certain theatricality that produces, which I think feels a more useful term for me to describe my experience rather than to label the work. So I'm sort of backing out of the question really, but with some performativity and theatricality thrown in there for good measure.
It's the only way is to back out of that kind of question, because it's and it can't be an is or isn't, I don't think either, and I think thinking about encounter, connection, event, dramaturgy, theatricality, the qualities of certain types of practices and what they prompt from us as audience members, that's probably the more fertile way of kind of addressing them as forms. And then of course there's the determinism of how people term their own work. Like somebody said in the chat, I think that I call my work online performance because if I called it film I wouldn't get funded from the Arts Council, and fair enough. Like there's certain things that are about how you want the work to be shared, how you want it to be funded and understood. And to a certain extent that's down to the artist, isn't it, in terms of how they and I like the fact that Jo Bannon, coming back to Jo Bannon's work, called her work an audio essay, and that seemed to me to be a really kind of productive way of characterizing what that work was doing in terms of its form and dramaturgy, like Harry was saying.
I hate to put this out there, but I wonder if really the difference between the two is money. That, I've had the great opportunity as a performer to do a lot of green screen film. And when you're working in green screen film, you're not performing with a scene partner. You're there by yourself. There's a bunch of cameras. There's a tennis ball for your eye line. And it is a completely bizarre experience that necessitates its own kind of training. And and that's sort of what we're doing right now. We all are, in our disparate places, not interacting, pretending that we're somehow interacting. If we were making a piece of theater, we would try to pretend we're somehow in the same place, and Zoom is a horrible theater. I mean, Zoom is incredibly limiting to make theater. I have yet to make a piece of theater on Zoom. I think Zoom is a terrible place to make theater because it's not made for theater. It's made for all sorts of this kind of thing. And so I just wonder, what makes it theater maybe is that it's scrappy and we're doing it on nothing.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly the failures of Zoom as a stage is definitely what I took from End Meeting for All. It's this, and False Entertainment are known as loving failure. Failure is their aesthetic and just constantly reveling, sitting in the failure. But it was the attempt to get a drama going. It was just like this perfectly performing the frustrations of working in this way. And I mean, the first line is, has it started? I mean, we've all, I think that's been the catchphrase. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Has it started? And just these tiny little micro dramas happening on your screen. And the attempt to try and unify them is futile. And for a theatre piece, for a conversation like this, it's fine. But to try and create a narrative, you've got to have a kind of shared world. And we don't have a shared world. We've got like a shared platform, which we've got a digital version of ourselves projected onto us. So it's best to embrace it, I think, and to really just enjoy the fragmentary nature of it, because new stories will emerge. I should say as well, just because we've got just 5 minutes left, so we'll have to wrap up, but because we're in a live and information science context as well with DocPerform, the question of classification is so key. Classification will ultimately determine interpretation and experience. And one of the interesting things is how performance can be considered a document, and what are the performative qualities of new document formats. such as interactive novels that the British Library are currently archiving. And for us at DocPerform, it's just incredibly exciting, this kind of interdisciplinary work. And it's all going beyond interdiscipline in a way, what I take from tonight, that it feels like a new discipline is emerging, or disciplines are emerging, about forms of different audiences, different ways of experiencing or performing the body in space. How do we all sort of coexist in the cloud, and just this sense of somehow theatre being the place where the detritus of the web, of the cloud, is somehow recycled or sort of embraced, the glitches, and to try and not to sort of resist the accelerationism of the digital revolution, to try and, vaporwave, for instance, that would be an example of the recycling of digital detritus. I think internet theatre is doing that on a much larger scale. Okay, I think I'm going to wrap up the webinar now. Someone has said in the chat as well, it's very true, we haven't spoken about senses really. Harry did with the ice cube that was in there, but kind of scent and touch and the haptic and all of this, that's another webinar, I think, and that's definitely another area to think about different technologies, how will haptic tech play a role, and particularly as things like VR are becoming more domesticated, new storytelling mediums will emerge. I would like to thank all of our panel for a fantastic session. It's been absolutely fascinating. I'd like to thank all of our audience for your brilliant contributions, your questions, incredibly lively chat. Someone asked if the chat will be saved. I hope so. I can't see the button for it, but I think from memory, if I stop, I think it saves it. Does anyone know? I'm not even... I'm gonna, yes. I'm gonna. Oh, someone's written messages. You have to download it. The host can save it. Oh, blimey. Okay. So I tell you what, I can probably do that. I'll keep the meeting open. So thank you to everyone. I will. I'm going to look for this download button. But I'm going to symbolically turn my video and sound off now to end it. This recording will be made available on the DocPerform website in a few weeks. Conversation can still happen on Twitter, #InternetTheatre. Go over to the DocPerform website to catch up with all of the publications and new events we'll be doing in the coming years. So thank you, Harry. Thank you, Elena. Thank you, Joe. Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.
Thank you, Joe, as well, for hosting.
Pleasure. Oh, bye-bye. Yeah.
Little interlude. Thanks.
About a baby.
Thanks, everyone. Great to chat with you all.
So great.
Bye.
It's funny to watch the count go down.